Okay, so let's do something similar to what's on page 120. This is going to be how I usually start these sketches, which is with a frame. So I'm doing an exterior environment sketch. I usually figure out my image proportion first. So here I've got something sort of, widescreen, so I just drew this frame to match the available proportion of my camera. And then I start thinking about composition first. So I usually put a couple of tick marks. And this is kind of how I do the rule of thirds. And what I mean by that is that you divide your canvas, your image area, into thirds. So a horizontal line here and here, dividing this into 3 equal parts, and then a vertical there and there, dividing that into 3 equal parts. And then what you do is you place your focal point at the intersection of one of these 4 locations. I also like to set my horizon either high, so if I set it up here in my horizon line, or low in this case. So I never put the horizon line dead center unless I'm doing like a fisheye lens photographic effect, which I'll cover in a few pages. So you've already seen from the step-by-step in the book how the basic steps go. So I'm going to draw something a little bit different. That one has a low horizon, and this one I'm going to draw a little bit higher horizon. So the first thing I do is set up my horizon, and now I start to think about my vanishing point. So I want just a very, very basic grid. Usually don't worry much about complex perspective and details in getting started. So first is sort of get the composition, then a basic grid. So I just pick a vanishing point. It's going to be 1 point perspective in the middle of our image. Throw down a couple guidelines. I should say that I'm using a Copic marker C1, which is just enough for us to hopefully both see here. That allows me a lot of flexibility later if I make mistakes, if I want to make changes. So just a basic perspective grid, and then I just think about shapes. So that's really all I need for the perspective, and before I start adding a lot of dimension to the shapes, I just want to compose them. So I'm going to say, well, I have a focal point here. We're going to have this kind of building structure. It's kind of this like observatory thing. I'm not really thinking about perspective, I'm just thinking about shapes. And in fact, you could just do it like this, just block out silhouettes. Maybe this is maybe going to be the height of a person through here. And it's sitting kind of on this rocky outcropping here at the edge of top of a mountain. Okay, so what I want to do in this sketch is I really want to block out and highlight all the perspective constructions that we've been explaining throughout the book. Obviously not all of them in one tutorial, but I want to demonstrate those and how you would block out your scene. I'm probably not going to get to the point of detailing the whole thing. So this is going to be my foreground element, and we could even come closer and put bigger elements. We can play with that in a minute. So I'm going to go out to the midground, and let's say I wanted a similar size structure further away. Well, we could draw a line out to the horizon line for a reference vanishing point here, similar to the example on page 120. And then if I go like this across the top and I just take the height of this building to the distance, I can then locate another one there. So now I know that that's the same height further away. And let's put that on a cliffside. And then maybe there's a cliff going up behind here. So you see I'm just thinking about shapes. The only thing I worried about with the perspective was get the height correct. And it's going to just be similar, not exactly the same. Maybe a couple more outbuildings here. And then this cliffside comes towards us, and now I'm going to use my perspective grid. And even though it's going to be a jagged line, and let's see, it comes over like that. Okay, and we're going to be looking down here, cliffside, and this is going down. We're going to look down in here into a canyon. And down way below, I'm going to put, let's put a lake. So now I'm just thinking about this plane, horizontal plane, the ground plane down below, and I'm just drawing like the edge of a landmass here, and you could shade it if you want. Maybe put some far buildings poking up off of that. And then way over here in the distance, I'm going to put some mountains and lower mountains over here on the left, way out on the horizon. And then maybe there's some ships out there on that water. So this will be a city or something down here. So I'm just blocking in again shapes to remind myself and play around with composition. Maybe there's some more ships over there. We got some people over here. And let's bring this plane forward. Let's just put some rectangles. I'm already starting to do curvilinear perspective, which it's very hard for me to do straight one point because I'm so used to doing curvilinear. And that really starts to be affected out here at the edges. You would start to see more of that curvature, but I'm going to try and stick to this one-point grid that we've got going. So that means all my lines here, right, should be parallel to the horizon. So any line cutting straight across, let's put a couple more of those over there. Okay, now I just want to define some planes and some blocks that you could use for buildings. Put in some people for scale. Maybe we'll throw a ramp in here, a couple of ramps, just so you can see we've got multiple sort of auxiliary vanishing points and that sort of thing going on. We'll do that with a staircase, maybe going down the cliffside. So I'm going to start. Now the next step you could do, you could stay with markers, and you could just say, well, this is going to be my foreground element. I want to work a little bit more on that shape before I worry about the volume. So you could work just on the silhouette and you could darken in the whole thing. Maybe let's try that just with this element here. Maybe just the ground, in fact. Let's do something like this. And let's just darken. I'm not really thinking about lighting. I'm just thinking about, right, big foreground shape. And there's going to be this building. Some little structure sticking off the side of it. And maybe another little outbuilding over here. And let's see, we could even darken up a couple of those guys. Maybe this cliffside. And down this big undercut here. And so if you've watched my atmospheric perspective tutorial on my YouTube channel, this is very similar to that. Just thinking about shape, not worrying yet about anything more than the basic perspective. So now, if I was going to do this as a working drawing, and I wanted to do a nicer drawing later, I might just draw through everything and not worry about where the perspective is. Meaning, sorry, I would worry about perspective, but I wouldn't worry about starting and stopping lines and overlaps. I would just draw through everything and then do a nice overlay later on. So I think let's treat it like a working sketch, and then maybe I'll throw some marker back on top to try and delineate some of the shapes once we find them. So I'll start by just dropping in the horizon, like so, locating that vanishing point again. I'm using a Pilot Hi-Tech C, and this is a very, very fine line one, and so that I can try to get some of these mountains and things to be lighter into the distance. So you see I've got a couple overlaps going there, maybe a mountain off in the distance behind, and then even now you can start to add a little bit of line weight to get these guys to stick in front of the other ones. There's a couple of more overlapping mountains, and then the key to setting them in space, one of the keys, is where they hit right below or above the horizon. So in this case we hit right out at the horizon. That tells me it's a long, long ways away. Okay, and maybe a couple little buildings out there on the horizon we can just barely see. In fact, they could even be beyond the horizon, just the tops are sticking up. Very, very clear day. And then here, if I end this mountain just a little bit below hitting that ground plane, and this one even lower, okay, that starts to move towards us. So by indicating how far below the horizon an object lands, you can tell the viewer where that object is in space. So if I want that far side of the harbor and maybe a large cruise ship or something over there, right, that's where I place it. So you have to be very careful about the distance from the horizon down, okay, to these elements. So I'll just make that a little triangle building, that little arrow. And so just trying to get those, maybe there's a little river that goes out of there. This is like a peninsula that sticks out. And so you see I can just move forward in space. And as I move forward, I can start making larger buildings. And I'm still sort of just thinking about shapes and silhouettes, not yet adding depth or dimension to the buildings themselves. Just kind of want texture, some basic lines, and then you can go back and detail it. And I might even do that in an overlay, not even detail it or worry about dimension yet. Now if I wanted to put, say, a line down here on the ground that was converging off in the distance, I could do that. I could say, well, this shoreline is going to come right towards us. Well, we could just come in here and say, okay, well, let's just go out here and find a new vanishing point. So I've got a new VP out there, and then I'm going to have that come towards us like this. So that could be, you know, some sort of a beach. Here we could just make that a wiggly line. Down there people would just be specks, maybe some umbrellas. Make this also a wiggly line, maybe those are trees. Okay, we could have some more verticals sticking out of here like there are buildings. So we've got that happening, and that, right, is converging, but since it's pointing towards this direction, you just pick a new vanishing point on the horizon. So we've kind of got this shoreline that goes over here to our main vanishing point, and then we've got this shoreline going this direction to another vanishing point. And let's come in here with this cliffside. I'll come back and add some heavier line work in a moment, but for now I'm just trying to see what I blocked out with my markers. I had a building here, and then I had another building there, here, and then there was that cliffside. And that's where it sits on top of this, some sort of cracks, this broken edge of this cliff. And then I'm back to the original vanishing point here, right? And I can now throw a couple guidelines on this plane. And now if I wanted to, I could even start to foreshorten some of those. Let's say if anywhere I want to make equal distance, of course, we can just divide it. We can find the midway point. We could draw from corner through midway, and I could start to multiply. Say this is a, you know, we want those to be equal distance, those lines on the ground. So you can start using all those same tools. Let's go here to the bigger building, sort of a dome top. So here I have to think about an ellipse. All right, so here would be a straight line right through the horizon. We wouldn't see anything. Then I can say, well, I'm going to go very, very slow convergence. So I'm going to very thin ellipse, then even less degree here. And then that would be the equal degree above and below, right? So the same distance above, same distance below, you'd get the same degree ellipse. So I'm adding those through there. And then, let's see, I'm going to say that a person is about that tall. Okay, and now you can move that person around. You could say, well, let's take him over here to the left. Sorry, that's not left, that's right. Over to the right, and then there would be the person standing on the other side of the cliff. Okay, and then we take this person back into space, into the distance, and then here would be the person. Okay, standing back by these buildings. And that gives you relative scale. Now, if you wanted to, you could, of course, take this person even further, and you could float them out into space using your main vanishing point. You could find their height. There's their height here, and then you could take that down to the ground, right? And you have to decide how far down below, right, at this far back, how far down do they go until they hit the ground? And that's where you would start to foreshorten their height in 3-point. But obviously, if he's this tall here, right, or that tall, probably not on the beach. It's going to hit way, way below the frame. That might put him like way down here. Okay, so now I've got to move further into the distance. So anywhere you want, and what's fun about doing sketches like this is you're playing with elevation, but you still use the same horizon line. If things point in different directions, of course, you use a new vanishing point. But you can see, we see more of this ground plane, so we see more of it from above. And you just have to play with scale. And it's really fun to play with altitude changes in a simple 1-point perspective. What about, let's put a little cliffside here in this little mountain top. And you can see I'm just working out the big shapes. I'm not really worried about giving anything dimension so much. I did with the ellipses. I gave it a little bit of volume, but you can do all that stuff after. Really, I'm most worried about placing things compositionally in perspective. Here's the base of those mountains way off in the distance. Maybe there's another cityscape. This is going to be water through here. Put some little boats out there. Okay, and so you just get your composition working, get your basic perspective done, define your ground planes. Right, now let's put a ramp in here. Let's say I wanted to put a staircase. Let's say I wanted to, let's see, this ground comes around like this. Okay, I can throw a couple guidelines across it. And then right here, it turns and it goes down. Okay, well, if I'm going to turn and make this slope go downward, okay, how do I find this line right here? Well, you could do it a couple of ways. You could first draw a section, right, through like this, and then you could find the height. Then you could draw from the bottom corner back to your vanishing point. I'm going to slide up so we can see this. Then you could go there, and then you could bring this line forward from your VP. Okay, and then there you'd have the other corner, and then you could connect the two. So that's how you could get the proper convergence to your ramp. And then you could come in and start doing the side view convergence. You have to now divide this equally. So you could divide the distance, right? You could set up another VP. You could divide that equally with the foreshortening. You could make one step here, for instance, and then multiply that back with the foreshortening and then go up. And those become your stairs. And so each spot you draw a vertical, and then you just connect across. And then that goes back to your vanishing point. So you could start to put in your staircase that way. Another way to do this, instead of drawing a square section and then projecting that out, is to draw an auxiliary vanishing point. And I don't think I'm going to have room for it on this piece of paper, unfortunately. But if this is in top view pointing at my vanishing point, I can just draw this all the way up, like so, and I could extend my vanishing point upward 90 degrees. That should be 90 degrees to the horizon, upward, and then this can go upward until those hit. That'll make an auxiliary vanishing point, auxiliary VP. And then I could just draw from that auxiliary vanishing point back to this. And so those should hit at this line. Those three lines will all converge at the same spot. Here I used a section to do it, but you could also draw it this way. Obviously it's not going to fit on my piece of paper, so the section was the better way to go. So let's add a little bridge across here. So I could just cut straight across like this. Okay, that's where it hits my cliffside. Maybe we add a little thickness to it. really when it comes time to start adding volume to everything, it's just a little tedious, but it's not really that difficult if you use your vanishing point. So let's add a little dimension across there. So this is my walkway. So I'm going to add some heavier line weight now so we can start to see this thing come to life a little bit. So let's start adding some volume to some of these buildings. Okay, let's start with this guy, this bridge. Very structurally suspect that we can span that with no supports, but it's okay. So let's go to my vanishing point, and I'm going to put just a couple lines across here. So let's say it was made up of similarly dimensioned, like big pieces of plywood or something. Those lines would all point back to my vanishing point. So I want to be very heavy because I want to overlap my beach and my city in the distance. Then I'd bring this cliffside around here. You know what, I'm going to go to something even heavier. So I'm going to grab a Sharpie. I don't really have a Sharpie. Oh, here we go. Let's use this big, thick Copic. Okay, let's go to this building. Let's say I wanted to add dimension to that volume. We can go into space. So let's say there's the front plane, like so. And then here's where it hits the top of our mountain, and I go back towards the vanishing point. I'm basically just drawing boxes at this point in 1-point perspective. And that's our depth. And then to make it look interesting, it's really a matter of detailing. So you might have some vents on it. You might cut a corner off of it. Okay, cut another corner, extend outward a bit, maybe run a pipe across the ground, turn it towards the building, connect it over here. All right, this is a round building. Sides are vertical, so those are perpendicular to the horizon. And then we can see a section line across it up here. And it's got this domed top. And maybe it's got some element across the top. A couple of little design lines. Again, I'm just sort of making this up as I go, but you get the idea. There's a person. And this whole element, there's another person. Oh, action stance on that guy. Okay, and then this whole thing is in front, and then we have our stairs, which I'm not going to take the time to draw right now. But there's our ramp that's set up for that, so maybe this follows a slope of ground. Maybe it flattens out a bit here. Get our overlaps. Let's just push this building. If this has some dimension, you can almost just start to shade it in and look at your VP. Something sticks out a bit over there. And let's darken up that cliff face. Puts a couple of contour lines on there. Okay, so this is the basic idea. We can take the height across the bridge, find our other person over there. There's some, I don't know, some solar panels over here or something on the ground. Another person there way in the distance. Another building. Add a little dimension to it. So it's really about moving around in space, using your vanishing point, right? Using the grid you set up. So even see the base of that cliff, I even point back towards that vanishing point. Let's say if I draw a cross here, and I wanted to do a ripply line across here to show that, like a contour line, it still follows my points back to my vanishing point. Like there's striations in the rock. So even if we did across here, you know, that's sort of the section at the top of the cliff. you do the same through here. And that all has to point back to my VP. So that's basically it. That's kind of how I'd rough those out. Use the things we've talked about and explained in the book so far. All right, so this is very much the same way I did that example on 120. And I'll put a little stronger frame on it now. So I think hopefully that helps you. That's a nice example, I think, of just a working sketch where you worry about what you're drawing, not so much how you're drawing it. Worry about composition, worry about silhouettes and shapes first. Then you start to add thickness, right? Add volume to these things second. And you can always come back and tighten up the perspective. Okay, using your guidelines, detailing, adding graphics, later on adding values, adding colors. All those things will help. But to get started, just lay out a basic grid and then use your height, right, transferring ability to move around figures, move around buildings. Get your basic forms, your shapes first. Focus on what you're drawing, and then you can always use the guidelines to come back, right, and tighten it up and do an overlay and then detail it, right, and then come back and spend the time to drop in a staircase, for instance, right, which it's not a difficult construction, it just takes a while. And that's the thing with drawing environments. You don't really want to rush the detailing because the detailing is really what makes it look real, and without that, it just looks like, like this, basically. A bunch of big basic forms. One last thing I'll do is just throw a little bit of value on here to really try and simplify this scene a little bit. So I'm just going to come over here with a number 3 marker. And I'm going to block that out. You see, I'm even putting it on top of the surface as well. I'm just trying to get these big shapes to read. Smearing my marker a bit, but that's okay. This part of this ground plane is a little bit closer to us, so we could really push the contrast there. And then this is really the same, so let's make this also the same marker. And if you wanted to, you could say, well, that's vertical. I know it's going to have less light on it, so you could start to shade things a little bit. But for now, let's just block in the whole thing, including the ground plane. There you go. So in a simple way, that's kind of puts it more in the foreground, applying a little bit of atmospheric perspective to it. And that's the basic block in. And hope that helps.